Okay, so neoliberalism. The definition, according to the early proponents of neoliberalism, is that it's all about free markets and less government. But when we examine it thoroughly, neoliberalism is essentially a short way to describe a global imperialist finance capital model that gained popularity around the 70s and 80s. Neoliberalism's clear goals are privatization, deregulation, free trade, and austerity. And these all work in tandem to essentially fortify class power and favor capitalist interests, especially as a response to social movements that had been gaining workers more rights and power, and B, existing socialist states that also aided these concessions. Neoliberalism is effectively counter-revolutionary. Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the UK, is famous for saying there is no alternative, essentially presenting neoliberalism as inevitable or natural. The common neoliberal talking point, we need to get the state out of the economy, is nothing more than a distraction. Neoliberal governments have had absolutely no issue using the state aggressively for their own economic purposes. To start, the free market has never really existed because markets have to be created, whether through legal or political means. And also, neoliberalism doesn't actually shrink government involvement as it promises. It just kind of reorients the priority away from being a social welfare arm to an arm used to bail out capitalists, protect private property.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
So this is their clever cover. The anti-government rhetoric means they no longer want to use state power to help people. They just want to use it to get tax cuts for themselves in their home. But hindsight is 2020, and we can actually now examine, how it has all played out, and we can see that the policy is always pro-capitalist, anti-worker. Here's a passage from Chris Harman's Theorizing Neoliberalism from 2008. State intervention has been used to drive through attacks on workers, as with Margaret Thatcher's anti-union laws or the use of the police against the miners' strike of 1984 and 5. But it has also repeatedly been used to protect sections of capital against the effects of crisis in a way supposedly ruled out by neoliberal ideology. The U.S. state helped bail out Chrysler when it came close to going bust in 1979. It took charge of negotiations in the 1980s to prevent U.S. banks from being dragged under by unpayable debts from Latin American countries. In 1998, it propped up the long-term capital management hedge fund, and most recently, through the Federal Reserve Central Bank, it has tried to limit the damage caused to the financial system by the subprime mortgage crisis. Indeed, states have intervened more to deal with crises since the 1970s than in the 1960s and 1950s, for the simple reason that the crises have been much more severe. And now a quick quote from Susan George from her speech in 1999 about neoliberalism. Let me stress how important it is to understand that the vast neoliberal experiment we are all being forced to live under has been created by people with a purpose. Once you grasp this, once you understand that neoliberalism is not a force like gravity, but a totally artificial construct, you can also understand that what some people have created, other people can change. We're going to link all the sources in the description, and we highly recommend that you take your education further than just our video.
Viva Chile, viva el pueblo, vivan los trabajadores. Estas fueron mis últimas palabras. Tengo la certeza de que mi sacrificio no será en vano.
So neoliberalism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. We're going to cover the origins so we can orient ourselves. One of the key figureheads of the early neoliberal period is Augusto Pinochet, the leader of Chile after the successful coup against Salvador Allende and his democratically elected government that was leaning socialist. You just saw Allende in the last clip addressing the people that elected him for the last time. David Harvey actually calls this the first neoliberal experiment in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism from 2005. We're going to be referring to this a few times throughout the video. The quote is, "The first experiment with neoliberal state formation is worth recalling occurred in Chile after Pinochet's coup on the little September 11th of 1973. The coup against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende was promoted by domestic business elites threatened by Allende's drive towards socialism. It was backed by U.S. corporations, the CIA, the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. It violently repressed all the social movements and political organizations of the left and dismantled all forms of popular organization, such as the community health centers in poor neighborhoods. The labor market was freed from regulatory or institutional restraints, like trade union power, for example." Other key figureheads from this time would have been Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of the UK, starting in 1979 and then throughout some of the 80s, and Ronald Reagan, the President of the US, also in the 80s. It is worth noting that every president since Reagan has maintained the neoliberal system. Okay, so the post-World War II period from 45 to 73 or so delivered some key social welfare progress in places like the US. This was probably because capital at the time was way more intimidated by socialism and the labor militancy of the time. And then in 1973, there was an oil crisis that caused like a global recession in the mid-70s. And this was essentially the perfect opportunity for the capitalists to jump in, exploit this crisis, and revert those gains that the workers had just made. So it was at this point that neoliberalism was effectively put into practice. As mentioned, the first neoliberal experiment was in Chile with Pinochet, and then Thatcher 79 in the UK, and Reagan 81 in the US. And then from there, it quickly spread throughout the globe, kind of becoming the dominant system through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So neoliberalism was kind of a direct and rational, from the perspective of the capitalist, response to, rising living standards and standards for workers that had been occurring during that time. And things like higher taxes on the rich, stronger unions and social welfare programs, these were eating away at the capitalist profit. At the heart of the problem lies a burgeoning disparity between the declared public aims of neoliberalism, well-being of all, and its actual consequences, the restoration of class power. He also wrote, neoliberalization creates conditions for class formation. So the takeaway, at least for me, is that neoliberalism, while it claims to be about free markets, fairness, and prosperity for all, is more so a tool to restore class power or to create class in general. Initially, neoliberalism pushed privatization, deregulation, a bunch of austerity measures. We'll cover these in a moment. Then as time went on, they expanded through institutionalization using things like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and trade agreements like NAFTA and TPP. So neoliberalism became the global default, and it maintains itself through debt dependency.
The era of big government is over.
By the mid-90s, it's clear neoliberalism is a bipartisan project, and it has remained that way ever since. All right, now let's get into those core components of neoliberalism. So privatization. Anything that was state-owned is now sold off to private companies. This would include things like water, energy, transportation, prisons, housing, so many things.
From France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore, privatization is on the move.
One of America's greatest strengths is our free market. A thriving private sector is the lifeblood of our economy.
Under socialism, the means of production are collectively owned and operated. Under neoliberalism, though, even the means of basic survival, like having healthcare, housing, water, are privatized and commodified. The next aspect of neoliberalism is deregulation, which essentially means getting rid of any laws that protect workers, consumers, the environment, and at the same time, beefing up laws that protect capital.
Regulations, oh boy. It's a lot of regulations.
The American consumer is being hurt by government regulations.
Cut the red tape of regulation.
Naomi Klein is another prominent critic of neoliberalism, and she argues that deregulation is just a cover for corporate greed. Okay, on to austerity. So when capitalism crashes, as it tends to do, the neoliberal response is to cut social services, lay off public workers. This way, the working class feels the effects of the recession or the crisis, and the rich are unscathed. Not only unscathed, but they can use the crisis to scrape more off of your plate onto theirs. In the last 20 years, we've seen a few massive wealth transfer events like the 2008 recession and the COVID pandemic. Harvey writes, but one persistent fact within this complex history of uneven neoliberalization has been the universal tendency to increase social inequality and to expose the least fortunate elements in any society, be it in Indonesia, Mexico, or Britain, to the chill winds of austerity and the dull fate of increasing marginalization. The incredible concentrations of wealth and power that now exist in the upper echelons of capitalism have not been seen since the 1920s. Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis also points out that austerity is imposed undemocratically on the people, on the masses, the vast majority of the world, while the bankers enjoy socialized losses. Austerity is violent, and it takes its violence overseas as well, where it creates a permanent class of debtor that it can extract labor from before they even see a paycheck. And debt is a common weapon wielded by imperialist nations. The Global South often pays interest on their debt, that the interest alone is higher than the original amount that they borrowed. It's very much violent. This leads us into free trade and globalization. They call it free trade, but free trade agreements are never free. It's the same old Western imperialism. These agreements are, of course, written by corporate lawyers, transnational capital, at the expense of workers and the environment. They even slip in provisions like the ISDS, which gives corporations permission to sue governments. Instead of governments suing corporations for like ecological disasters or workplace deaths, it's corporations suing governments when they try to do something about it. Absolutely insane. Harvey details the first example of this globalization, aided by the IMF, of course. He wrote, Pinochet brought these economists into the government, where their first job was to negotiate loans with the International Monetary Fund. Working alongside the IMF, they restructured the economy according to their theories. They reversed the nationalizations and privatized public assets, opened up natural resources, fisheries, timber, etc. to private and unregulated exploitation, in many cases riding roughshod over the claims of indigenous inhabitants, privatized social security, and facilitated foreign direct investment and freer trade. The right of foreign companies to repatriate profits from their Chilean operations was guaranteed.
This agreement has the strongest labor standards of any trade agreement in history, including setting fair hours, prohibiting child labor, prohibiting forced labor. It includes the highest environmental standards in history.
So I was going to include a clip of Noam Chomsky there, essentially kind of debunking those claims there by Obama, but his affiliation with Epstein has tarnished his work for me. The point, though, is that these free trade agreements are specifically written to protect capital and allow for the exploitation of foreign workers. Lenin's theory of imperialism is once again relevant. The gunboat diplomacy of the 19th century has just been replaced by the 21st century trade agreement, but the goals are the same: extracting resources and capital from the global south and funneling it north. Another key aspect that really needs to be understood about neoliberalism is that it effectively shifted the economy away from production, like actually making things, to finance capital, just like moving money around. And it's this system that helps to create enormous wealth for a few white dudes while rendering the entire system unstable. Here's Harvey again. He wrote, "A wave of innovations occurred in financial services to produce not only far more sophisticated global interconnections, but also new kinds of financial markets based on securitization, derivatives, and all manner of futures trading. Neoliberalization has meant, in short, the financialization of everything. This deepened the hold of finance over all other areas of the economy, as well as over the state apparatus." Another way to break it down is that corporations and capitalists used their surplus, their profits, to make them more profits through financialization. The previous model, you would have seen the capitalists using this profit, this surplus, to expand their operations, open a new factory, invest in the infrastructure, hire more people in order to chase profits in that regard. But financialization is much quicker. Harvey argues that this contemporary capitalism is increasingly characterized by the creation of money through money, without the corresponding production of real value through labor, aka more money added, but without any added value to back that up. He uses terms like anti-value and fictitious capital to explain this. Even Marx had accurately predicted that this would happen in late-stage capitalism all the way back in the 1800s. Okay, now for the neoliberal state. So if the promises of neoliberal policy were accurate, the neoliberal state would be sort of like an oxymoron, because according to them, neoliberalism is against the state and state power. But in reality, neoliberalism requires a strong state to achieve its aims, like property rights, corporate bailouts. Harvey argues the biases arise in particular out of the treatment of labor and the environment as mere commodities. In the event of a conflict, the typical neoliberal state will tend to side with a good business climate as opposed to either the collective rights and quality of life of labor or the capacity of the environment to regenerate itself. The second arena of bias arises because, in the event of a conflict, neoliberal states typically favor the integrity of the financial system and the solvency of financial institutions over the well-being of the population or environmental quality.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
So in the same year that Reagan said the government is the problem, he also, as the head of the government, used the government as a solution to the strikes that were carried out by air traffic controllers. And his solution, as the head of the government, was to fire them. Okay, here's Susan George again. She says, the fashionable free market view that states and markets are somehow intrinsically opposed to each other emerges as something of a myth. The free market needs the protection of states, and it needs their powers of enforcement. The minimalist state is, quite simply, utopian, in the original sense of the word. It exists nowhere. At issue, therefore, is not whether modern economies require any involvement from the state, but to what ends and in whose interests the state operates. The central call of the World Bank's 1997 World Development Report for an effective state, thus, inevitably raises the question, what does the bank mean by effective? Effective for what? Effective for whom? One of Lenin's core teachings is to look at what the state does, not what it says. The neoliberal state talking points are all about freedom. But whose freedom? And you can find out by examining their actions. You'll see it means freedom for the ruling class to build more prisons, increase surveillance, invest in more weapons manufacturing, increase the military budget, increase militarization of the police. All of these freedoms just so happen to make them more money and protect their interests globally, and allow them to crush any opposition at home or abroad. So why do we hate neoliberalism? I assume by now in the video most of you have a decent understanding of what neoliberalism is, and I would hope that most of you also hate it. I think the reasons we hate neoliberalism are pretty simple and easy to get behind. I mean, wages have stagnated for the last 40 years. It's no coincidence that neoliberalism took hold in the 1980s. The climate crisis has accelerated drastically. Public services like housing, healthcare, and education have been defunded, privatized, or both. The rich have never been richer. I mean, it's super clear by now that democracy under neoliberalism is just bourgeois democracy. And working class people can't just vote their way out of it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't vote tactically where it matters, but voting alone will never dismantle the system designed to protect capital. Okay, to summarize, neoliberalism, a system that emerged in the late 70s and was popularized by Western powers by the early 80s, was born in order to restore class power. It does this through privatization, deregulation, austerity measures, globalization, and financializing everything. In Capital Volume 1, Marx wrote about how capital will disregard the health and lives of workers unless the society essentially forces it to behave otherwise. Now we have neoliberalism, which in effect is the project of removing that compulsion. It provides more freedom for the ruling class, the owning class, the exploiters, and it strips power from the rest of us.